the 5th of December 1975. In Manor Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a 19-year-old woman returned to her small apartment after finishing an ordinary day at work. Her name was Lindy Sue Beckler. At the age of 19, Lindy was beginning to build a life of her own, with dreams and plans still ahead of her. She had a job, a small home, and the belief that the place she returned to every day would always be the safest place she knew. But that night would become the final time Lindy walked through the door of her apartment. As darkness settled over the quiet neighborhood of Lancaster, no one knew that inside that room, an event was unfolding that would haunt the community for decades. Only hours later, an emergency call was made. Lindy's loved ones arrived at the apartment and discovered a heartbreaking truth, transforming the place that once held the hopes and future of a young woman into the scene of an unsolved homicide. Investigators quickly arrived to search for answers. But in 1975, they had only limited evidence and one unanswered question: what had truly happened to Lindy Sue Beckler during the final hours of her life? There were no direct witnesses who could describe everything that happened that night. There were no images capturing the last person seen with Lindy. The truth appeared to be buried within the remaining evidence left behind inside the small apartment. The samples collected from the crime scene in 1975 were later preserved in the investigation files for many years. For Lindy's family, time passed, but the pain of losing a young daughter never disappeared. They were forced to live with unanswered questions and the fragile hope that one day the truth would finally be discovered. Nearly half a century passed, and the Lindy Sue Beckler case remained an unsolved mystery. But sometimes, evidence that appears to have lost its value over time can become the most important key of all. And after 47 years of silence, the remaining traces from that fateful night finally opened the path toward the truth. Lindy Sue Beckler was born and raised in Pennsylvania, in a community where people often knew one another and life moved at a slower, quieter pace. By 1975, at just 19 years old, Lindy had begun entering adulthood, building a path of her own and looking toward a future she had always hoped for. Approximately 14 months before the tragedy occurred, Lindy married Philip Beckler. The young couple lived together at their home located at 104 Claus Drive, Manor Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It was a quiet residential neighborhood where families lived close to one another, neighbors knew each other, and people believed it was a safe place to build a life. For Lindy, that home was more than simply a place to rest after a long day. It represented a new chapter in her life, a more independent future, a small family of her own, and dreams that were slowly becoming reality. In her professional life, Lindy worked at a flower shop. The job suited her personality, as those who knew her described Lindy as a hard-working young woman, responsible and committed to the things she cared about. She loved the world of flowers and the happiness that her work could bring to others. Although she was still young, Lindy already had clear dreams for her future. One of her greatest wishes was to someday own her own flower shop, manage a business she loved, and build a stable life together with her family. At that time, Lindy Sue Beckler was simply a 19-year-old woman trying to create a future, just like many young people her age. She had plans, hopes, and a life that appeared to be moving peacefully forward. But beneath the quiet surface of the Manor Township neighborhood, an event was about to unfold that would forever change Lindy's life and the lives of those left behind. Before the tragedy occurred, Lindy Sue Beckler's life continued much like that of many young people entering an important stage of adulthood. At the age of 19, she was no longer only thinking about the days immediately ahead, but had already begun building a long-term future for herself and her small family. Her marriage to Philip Beckler had lasted only a little over a year, but it was a period in which Lindy was learning to adapt to a new role in her life. She and her husband were building their future together in Manor Township, where they had their own home and simple plans for what was ahead. For a young woman her age, it was a hopeful period as she slowly created the stability she had always wanted. Alongside her family life, her work at the flower shop was also an important part of Lindy's daily routine. She spent her days working, interacting with customers, and taking care of tasks that required attention to detail and patience. Those who knew her remembered Lindy as a responsible person who always tried to do her best in everything she was given. Her family and friends also described her as a friendly young woman, full of energy and someone who easily connected with those around her. Lindy was not someone who lived a withdrawn or isolated life. She had close relationships, people who cared about her, and those who saw her as a young woman with many positive things ahead. Like many people her age, Lindy had dreams of her own. She wanted to continue developing the career she loved, eventually own her own flower shop, and build a more secure future. Those plans were simple, but they reflected the hopes of a young woman determined to create the life she had always imagined. There were no signs that Lindy was entering a dangerous period of her life. The people who loved her believed there were still many years ahead for her to enjoy life, care for her family, and complete the dreams she had yet to achieve. But in one ordinary day in December 1975, everything changed forever. The 5th of December 1975 began like any ordinary day in the life of Lindy Sue Beckler. At the time, she was still a young woman maintaining her familiar routine at a flower shop in Pennsylvania, where she spent much of her day working and interacting with customers. That afternoon, after finishing her shift, Lindy left the shop and continued with several personal errands before returning home. The actions she took during those final few hours would later become important pieces of information for investigators as they attempted to reconstruct her final known movements before the tragedy occurred. After leaving work, Lindy stopped by the location where her husband, Philip Beckler, was working. There, she collected her wages before continuing on to other places in the area. She then went to a bank to cash her pay, a routine task that appeared completely ordinary in her daily life. Not long afterward, Lindy stopped at John Hare's village market to purchase some household necessities. According to investigators, the amount spent during that shopping trip was approximately $46. It was only a small detail from Lindy's final day, but it helped police establish a timeline of her last known activities before returning home. After completing her errands, Lindy left the store and drove back to the home she shared with her husband at 104 Claus Drive, Manor Township, Lancaster County, between approximately 6:45 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. Lindy was confirmed to have arrived at her residence. This would become the last time anyone outside the home was known to have seen her alive. At the time, no one realized these would be the final moments of Lindy Sue Beckler's ordinary life. To those around her, it was simply another winter evening like any other. But inside the small house on Claus Drive, a series of tragic events was about to unfold, becoming the beginning of one of the longest investigations in Lancaster County. And as darkness settled over the neighborhood, what happened next would become a mystery that investigators would spend nearly half a century trying to solve. After Lindy Sue Beckler returned to her apartment at 104 Claus Drive, on the evening of the 5th of December 1975, her ordinary life took a completely different direction. According to the investigation that followed years later, the perpetrator found a way to approach the apartment and enter the residence. Investigators believed that the person may have been familiar with Lindy's living environment, as David Vincent Sinopoli had previously lived in the same building. This led police to consider the possibility that he understood the layout of the residence and had an opportunity to approach the apartment area without drawing attention. Inside the place where Lindy lived her everyday life, an attack took place. The perpetrator used a knife, turning the small apartment into the scene of a serious crime. During the examination of the scene, police identified 2 knives connected to the case. One of them was taken from Lindy's own kitchen. The handle of that knife had been wrapped with a tea towel, suggesting that the perpetrator may have attempted to reduce the chance of leaving fingerprints or other traces during the attack. Investigators determined that Lindy had suffered a total of 19 stab wounds. Evidence at the scene indicated that the attack occurred inside the apartment, where the familiar surroundings of a young woman's home had become the location of a tragedy. After committing the crime, the perpetrator left the scene. There was no indication that significant valuable property had been taken from the apartment, suggesting that the incident was not a typical burglary. However, before leaving, the perpetrator left behind important evidence that investigators in 1975 were unable to fully analyze. The small biological traces remaining at the scene would later become a crucial factor in allowing the case to continue moving forward decades later. That night, no one knew that what happened inside Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment would begin a search for the truth that would last for nearly half a century. At around 8:40 p.m. on the 5th of December, 1975, only a few hours after Lindy Sue Beckler returned to her apartment in Manor Township, members of her family began to sense that something was wrong. Lindy's aunt and uncle went to her residence hoping to see her and make sure everything was all right. At first, it was nothing more than an ordinary visit, but as they approached the apartment on Claus Drive, they quickly noticed signs that caused concern. Near the front entrance, they discovered unusual evidence, including blood near the doorway. The discovery immediately suggested that something serious may have happened inside. Concern quickly turned into fear. They entered the apartment and discovered a heartbreaking scene. Lindy Sue Beckler, the 19-year-old woman who had been living an ordinary life with dreams and plans for the future, was found deceased inside her own home. That moment marked the end of what had seemed like a normal evening and became the beginning of an investigation that would continue for many years. The apartment where Lindy had built her life was now the scene of a serious crime that shocked the community of Manor Township and Lancaster County. Immediately after discovering what had happened, Lindy's relatives contacted police. Law enforcement units were quickly dispatched to secure the scene, gather initial information, and determine what had taken place inside the apartment. When investigators arrived at Lindy Sue Beckler's residence, they were confronted with a scene containing signs that this was not an accident or a random incident. And from that moment, the most important question began to emerge. Who had entered that apartment on Lindy's final night, and why? After receiving the report, police quickly arrived at Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment on Class Drive. The area surrounding her residence was secured to preserve the scene and allow investigators to begin their initial examination. As soon as they entered the apartment, investigators recognized that they were dealing with a serious crime scene. The evidence left behind indicated that an attack had taken place inside the residence. Blood was discovered near the front entrance, in several areas of the room, and on the carpet inside the apartment. These signs helped investigators begin reconstructing what may have happened during the short period before Lindy was found. During their examination, investigators documented several items inside the apartment that appeared to be out of place. A lamp had been knocked over, suggesting that some kind of struggle or disturbance may have occurred during the incident. However, investigators did not find clear evidence that the apartment had been entered with the intention of stealing property. Valuable belongings remained inside the residence, leading police to focus more on the possibility that this was a deliberate attack against Lindy rather than a typical burglary. At the scene, investigators collected numerous pieces of evidence that could potentially assist the investigation. Among them were knives connected to the incident, a tea towel wrapped around the handle of one knife, biological samples, and other traces left behind inside the apartment. In 1975, forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today. The evidence collected at the time could not immediately reveal the identity of the person responsible. However, investigators carefully preserved these materials because they could become important clues in the future. Alongside the processing of the crime scene, authorities conducted an autopsy to determine the cause of Lindy Sue Beckler's death. The examination concluded that Lindy died from severe injuries caused by a knife. Forensic doctors documented a total of 19 stab wounds on her body, confirming that she had suffered a violent attack before her death. In addition to determining the cause of death, the autopsy process also helped collect further biological evidence connected to the case. These samples were preserved in the investigation files, although their full potential could not be realized at the time. For investigators, the scene at Class Drive provided many important clues, but it still failed to answer the most critical question: who was responsible for Lindy Sue Beckler's death, and why? The case had now entered the investigative stage, where every remaining detail would be examined in the search for the truth. Immediately after the crime occurred in December 1975, Lancaster police launched a large-scale investigation to identify the person responsible for the death of Lindy Sue Beckler. During the early stages, investigators focused on reconstructing Lindy's final hours, examining her relationships, and identifying anyone who might have been connected to the case. Numerous people were interviewed. Individuals who had appeared in Lindy's life were investigated, and the evidence collected from her apartment was carefully documented as part of the investigation. However, at that time, the case faced major limitations due to the technology available. Police did not have a DNA database system that could compare biological evidence collected from the crime scene with potential suspects. The biological evidence was preserved, but it could not provide the answers investigators needed. As the years passed, although police continued reviewing the case, no clear suspect was identified. The investigation gradually reached a dead end and became an unsolved case that remained open for decades. By 1997, advances in DNA technology created a new opportunity. Investigators returned to the evidence collected from the 1,975 crime scene and began analyzing it using more advanced scientific methods. From the old samples, a male DNA profile was developed. This was a significant breakthrough because, for the first time, police had a biological trace that could potentially be directly linked to the person responsible for the crime. However, when this DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database of the United States, the result did not provide an answer. No individual in the system matched the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. The case once again fell into silence. But years later, as investigative technology continued to advance, Lancaster police decided to use a new method: genetic genealogy. This technique uses DNA information to search for distant biological relationships through genealogy databases. The crime scene DNA was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs for analysis. The results showed that the genetic profile was connected to a family branch with origins in the Calabria region of Italy. Using this lead, investigators began narrowing down the list of possible individuals. Through analysis of family connections, residential history, and other relevant information, police attention gradually focused on one name, David Vincent Sinopoli. However, to determine whether this man was truly connected to the 1975 case, investigators needed additional direct evidence. When investigators narrowed down the list of suspects and focused their attention on David Vincent Sinopoli, they needed strong direct evidence to confirm a connection between him and the case that had remained unsolved since 1975. In 2022, police began conducting a covert investigation to gather additional evidence from Sinopoli. Rather than confronting him directly, investigators quietly monitored his activities and looked for an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample without drawing attention. The goal was to compare biological evidence collected from Sinopoli with the male DNA profile that had been preserved in the Lindy Sue Beckler case file for decades. During surveillance, investigators discovered that Sinopoli had discarded a coffee cup after using it. It was an object that appeared to have no value, but to investigators, it could contain a crucial piece of evidence. The cup was collected and sent for forensic analysis. Experts examined the DNA left behind on the item and compared it with the DNA profile developed from evidence collected at the crime scene in 1975. The results confirmed what investigators had been searching for. The DNA found on the coffee cup matched the DNA recovered from the Lindy Sue Beckler case. Nearly 47 years after Lindy was killed, police finally obtained direct scientific evidence linking a specific individual to the crime scene. On the 17th of July 2022, David Vincent Sinopoli was officially arrested and charged in connection with the death of Lindy Sue Beckler. The arrest marked a major turning point in an investigation that had lasted nearly half a century. A case once considered nearly impossible to solve now had a specific suspect, supported by DNA evidence rather than speculation. However, the arrest was only the beginning. To reach a final verdict, prosecutors still needed to build a strong legal case and prove in court the connection between David Vincent Sinopoli and the murder that occurred in 1975. On the 17th of July 2022, David Vincent Sinopoli was arrested after police confirmed that his DNA matched the biological evidence collected from Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment in 1975. From that moment, Sinopoli faced the justice system nearly half a century after the crime occurred. Investigators focused on establishing the connection between him and the crime scene, as well as examining the evidence that had remained preserved within the case file for decades. Throughout the legal process, DNA evidence became the central element of the investigation. It was the most significant scientific evidence linking the accused individual directly to the murder of Lindy Beckler. Unlike in 1975, when forensic technology was not advanced enough to analyze and compare the small biological traces left behind, modern methods allowed investigators to return to the old evidence and uncover the answers that Lindy's family had been waiting for over many decades. Alongside the DNA results, prosecutors also reviewed the entire investigative record, including the fact that Sinopoli had lived in the same apartment building as Lindy at the time of the crime. This detail provided additional context regarding his potential access to the area where the victim lived. However, because nearly 47 years had passed between the crime in 1975 and the arrest, reconstructing every detail of that night remained extremely difficult. Many original witnesses were no longer able to provide complete information, while much of the case relied on physical evidence that had been carefully preserved over time. Faced with the evidence presented by prosecutors, particularly the DNA findings, David Vincent Sinopoli ultimately chose to accept legal responsibility rather than proceed with a full trial before a jury. This decision moved the case closer to its conclusion after decades without answers. For Lindy Sue Beckler's family, it represented a significant step forward in their long search for justice for the young woman whose life was taken in 1975. However, to officially close the case, the court still needed to review the evidence, the guilty plea, and determine the final legal consequences for David Vincent Sinopoli. To bring the Lindy Sue Beckler case to a conclusion after nearly half a century, prosecutors needed to build a strong case based on objective evidence, rather than relying only on statements or speculation. The strongest element in the case against David Vincent Sinopoli was the scientific evidence provided by DNA. This evidence played a decisive role in establishing a connection between the suspect and the crime scene from 1975. Biological samples collected from Lindy Sue Beckler's apartment at the time of the crime had been preserved for decades. As forensic technology advanced, these traces were re-examined and used to create a male DNA profile. However, for many years, this DNA profile could not identify the person it belonged to because no match was found in national databases. The breakthrough came when investigators used genetic genealogy technology to trace the origin of the DNA profile. This analysis allowed detectives to narrow their search and eventually focus their attention on David Vincent Sinopoli. To confirm the suspect's identity, police later collected a DNA sample from an item Sinopoli had discarded, a coffee cup, in 2022. Forensic testing showed that the DNA from the cup matched the DNA profile recovered from the Lindy Beckler case evidence. This became the most important scientific evidence throughout the entire investigation. In addition to the DNA evidence, prosecutors also examined circumstantial evidence connected to Sinopoli. At the time Lindy was murdered, Sinopoli lived in the same apartment building as the victim. This indicated that he had access to the area and was familiar with the surroundings where the crime took place. The connection between the location, combined with the DNA match, allowed prosecutors to argue that Sinopoli was directly linked to Lindy Sue Beckler's death. Beyond the newly discovered evidence, the 7-year-old case file itself also played an important role. Evidence collected in 1975 had been carefully preserved, allowing investigators to revisit the case using methods that were unavailable to police at the time. The entire investigation demonstrated the major transformation of forensic science. A case that had remained unsolved for decades was finally able to move forward through the combination of preserved evidence and modern technology. With a body of evidence consisting of DNA, circumstantial connections, and decades of investigative records, prosecutors completed their case against David Vincent Sinopoli and prepared to seek a final legal resolution for Lindy Sue Beckler. In 2023, after choosing to accept legal responsibility instead of proceeding with a full jury trial, David Vincent Sinopoli appeared before the Lancaster County Court to face charges related to the death of Lindy Sue Beckler. During the hearing, Sinopoli admitted responsibility for the charges brought against him, including third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. This guilty plea brought an end to the legal proceedings that followed a nearly 7-year-long investigation. Rather than going through a full trial with debates over evidence and testimony, the case was resolved through a plea agreement based on the evidence collected by prosecutors, particularly DNA evidence. In court, prosecutors emphasized that the biological evidence preserved from the 1975 crime scene was the key factor in identifying the person responsible. This evidence had endured over time and allowed investigators to revisit a case that had remained stalled for decades. After reviewing the case file and all related circumstances, the Lancaster County Court sentenced David Vincent Sinopoli to 25 to 50 years in prison. At the time of sentencing, Sinopoli was already an elderly man. As a result, the sentence effectively meant that he would likely spend most of the remainder of his life in prison. For Lindy Sue Beckler's family, the ruling could not restore the years lost or erase the pain that began on the 5th of December 1975. However, after nearly half a century of waiting, they finally received an answer about who was responsible for Lindy's death. The Lindy Sue Beckler case stands as a reminder that evidence once considered unusable can still become the key to truth when forensic science continues to advance. Nearly 47 years is an unbearably long time for a family to live with loss and the absence of answers. Since the 5th of December 1975, Lindy Sue Beckler's loved ones not only carried the grief of losing a 19-year-old young woman, but also lived with one unanswered question: who took Lindy's life? For decades, the case remained frozen within investigative files. The traces left inside her apartment in 1975 were not enough at the time to identify a responsible person. But time did not erase the truth. As forensic science advanced, evidence that once seemed limited by the technology of its era was able to speak again. The identification of David Vincent Sinopoli as being linked to Lindy's death finally brought the answer her family had waited nearly half a century to receive. Even so, the final verdict could not restore the years that were lost, nor could it return the time spent living in uncertainty and grief. The Lindy Sue Beckler case leaves behind a profound lesson about the value of evidence and persistence in the pursuit of justice. A small biological trace preserved from 1975 became the key that unlocked the truth decades later. Technology changes, investigative methods evolve, but the search for truth on behalf of those who are gone remains constant. In the end, after 47 years of waiting, the name Lindy Sue Beckler is no longer tied only to an unsolved case. Her story stands as a reminder that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be found.